I want to take a quick moment before we leave HTTP behind and talk about HTTPS. And when I say HTTPS, I mean what most people will generally call SSL over HTTP, or maybe a little more properly TLS over HTTP. So let me explain that because that sounds a little bit confusing. Generally speaking, HTTP is a clear text protocol, right? We can see all the data in clear text. That's what allows us to take a packet sniffer and analyze and look at that data so that it's available to us to troubleshoot or investigate or so on and so forth. There are some cases where it makes sense to not make that data so readily available. Think about logging into a website. You're actually entering a username and password, and that has to be transmitted across the wire so that the server can validate it. However, we don't want that information traveling across the wire, at least not in clear text, because anyone can be sniffing it and intercept that, and then they'll have your password. So that's one reason why HTTPS exists, is the ability to encrypt things going across the wire, encrypt that communication so it can't be seen, and that's done by utilizing either SSL or TLS, Secure Socket Layer, Transport Layer Security, over HTTP. So the same HTTP protocol, but using that within the confines of an encrypted communication stream. SSL was the more traditional way to do that. TLS is the more updated version, the better, more secure encryption protocol. But they both allow you to use HTTP with encrypted communications. So that's what we mean when we say HTTPS is secure HTTP. You generally know the difference in a couple ways. One is if you look at the traffic, you can't read it. That's obviously one way. If it's encrypted, you can't read the traffic. But also generally HTTPS operates over port 443 by default rather than port 80. So if you see 443, it's generally going to be HTTPS traffic. Now, the interesting thing here is you're not going to get a lot from a packet analyst perspective from HTTPS data. Really, you're just going to get client and or server certificates where they're present. And I'll show you an example of this here in a minute. We'll talk about normal stimulus and response for HTTPS. I'll show you a quick example. There's honestly not a lot to see. But when you have HTTPS data, you're not going to get a lot from it. It's for that reason when you talk about a security perspective, many organizations choose not to collect and store HTTPS data at all because you can't do much with it. You can extract those certificates, and that's certainly useful information. And of course, you'll have the lower layer information. You'll have the IP addresses that are communicating. But as terms of HTTP, you don't get anything. You don't get the content, you don't get the headers, you get none of that. So you just have that lower layer information. So most cases, it makes more sense to collect flow data, so source and dest IP address and port and timing information, rather than packet capture data for this individual type of traffic. That said, it's worth talking about here just so when you encounter it, you know what you're dealing with and you know why you can't see certain things. More and more things on the internet are relying on HTTPS by default. I believe if you go to google.com right now, you will be redirected to the HTTPS version of google.com. And many sites are starting to do that. So that's kind of, obviously there are benefits to that from a privacy perspective, but as packet analysts and security folks, that is kind of the bane of our existence, as it makes network communication hard when examining this type of data. Now, you can actually decrypt HTTPS information if you have the private certificates that go along with this. So if you happen to own the web server itself, or you're doing a man in the middle of sorts of that communication, then you can certainly intercept that traffic in that way. But that gets into a lot of confusing, complex things as well. So not going to dive into that too much, but I'm going to show you just a quick example of HTTPS communication. So let's talk now about the normal stimulus and response for an HTTPS transaction. I'm going to show this here, and you'll have a packet capture where you can go through this on your own, but we won't look at the packets because it's a rather uneventful thing. Now, for normal stimulus and response to HTTPS, here we have an example of a web client and a web server, and the web client is connecting to the web server, making a request via the HTTPS protocol, probably to port 443s. That's the standard protocol being used. Now, nothing changes in that we're riding on TCP as our transport layer protocol. So we begin with the TCP three-way handshake, which I've condensed here, and we don't need to talk about that. We know what that is by now. Now, what happens after this is the client and server hello process. So the most important thing, and this is really the thing with a lot of protocols, but especially ones where there are a lot of configuration options, is they have to agree upon a set of parameters. After all, web servers are designed or should be designed to work with as many web clients as possible because you want anybody to be able to browse your site in most cases. So web clients may support a different feature set of HTTPS, of encryption, than the web server. So you have to perform a negotiation. And this happens through this client hello and server hello flow process, wherein the web client sends the server information about the cipher suites and such that it supports, and the server responds and provides its own what it supports as well, and they negotiate ideally to the highest security level or the most strong encryption that both clients support. So that's what we have going on here in the client and server hello, is this exchange of information, and this part is in clear text. You can actually see this data being transferred across the wire. After that, we have the server and client certificate and or key exchanges. And this is occurring, and it's going to vary quite a bit depending upon what cipher suite and what encryption is chosen. At a minimum, keys will be exchanged between the two systems if we're talking about symmetric key cryptography. Sometimes certificates will be exchanged as well, and we've talked about certificates a little bit here. The certificate chain of trust to prove a server is the server and to legitimize the connection between them, so that data might be exchanged as well. In terms of extracting information that's useful from an HTTPS stream, generally speaking, this certificate that's sent from the server is going to be the only piece of useful information, and that's certainly useful in the context of security investigations. We're always interested to see if a weird server certificate is being sent, or if we observe a server certificate being sent that is consistent with another malicious transaction we previously seen by utilizing the threat intelligence we have. But that's all occurring again here in this server certificate and key exchange that is going in both directions between the web client and the web server. Finally, we have the process of issuing the change cipher spec command and sending a finished packet. And these packets can be split. They can actually be 2 packets, or they can be combined into 1. But what this is basically saying is, hey, we've negotiated everything, we've exchanged the appropriate information, and now everything that follows will be in the cipher spec that we've negotiated. Thus, everything after this point will now be encrypted communication, and you will not be able to see that data if you happen to be listening on the wire. Only these two parties involved can see this data because it's encrypted, and it's being decrypted on the other side of the communication based upon the transmitted details. So this is obviously a little bit more involved than just a normal HTTP transaction and most of the things we looked at thus far. But this is the setup process you will see that allows an HTTPS communication stream to be encrypted. Now, if you want to learn a little bit more about this, you will need to read into cryptography and TLS, things of that nature, a little bit beyond the scope of this particular course. But I do want you to know what packets you'll be seeing, and you'll be seeing the packets that are described just as they are here if you actually go and look at an HTTPS data stream. Now, just because HTTPS is encrypted by default doesn't mean it's not also vulnerable to some of the different attacks that you'll see. Really, most all the HTTP attacks we've already talked about are still valid, and they'll still work. You just won't be able to intercept the traffic and read that. The client will still be able to read it because the client is the one who's in the encrypted session with the server. So all those things are still perfectly valid and generally still work. But also, HTTPS, since it introduces some additional overhead into the communication, all of the client certificate exchange and all that, some additional protocols. It also introduces some additional avenues for attack, and Heartbleed is one of those. It was one of those that came out, and it was very easy to exploit because it was just a matter of sending a single packet, specially crafted packet to a vulnerable server, and you receive some very interesting information back. So Heartbleed was very popular. You may have heard of it when it came out. Now, in this case, we have System A, who's our attacker, and System B, who's our web server. We have an established HTTPS connection that we've already set up. So we're talking, we've done send, SYNAC, ACK, and we have this connection being set up. Now, the interesting thing about this is all I really have to do is take advantage of what is called the keep alive functionality of an HTTPS connection. In short, keep alive is just what it sounds like. It's an ability to send a heartbeat packet every now and then. So not a heartbleed, but a heartbeat packet every now and then to keep a connection alive, even though no data is being transmitted. By including a very specially crafted string in that keep alive packet, you're actually able to exploit a vulnerability on the web server that would essentially cause a portion, a small fragment of the memory on that system to be read out and then sent back to System A. Would be able to get that back in a response. And if you're familiar with system memory, that's a pretty interesting thing because memory holds a lot of interesting goodies, including critical information, sensitive information, maybe even passwords, right? So this is a pretty significant attack, because if you did this enough, you could send a lot of these packets, send them over and over and over again. You would eventually get data back that was pretty juicy, pretty valuable. I was actually, when this vulnerability came out, a friend of mine was going to be on the red team for the Collegiate Cyber Defense competition a couple days later. I worked with him and hooked him up with a proof of concept code for this vulnerability, and he was able to use it against the VMware ESXi virtual host for one of the teams and find their administrative password for the ESXi host, take control over the whole network, crash their system, and they were hating life for a while. So that maybe wasn't the most fair thing since the vulnerability just came out, but it was very effective there, and you can only imagine how effective that would be in the real world as well.